He was the richest man in the city, and his son could choose any woman to call mother. But when the boy pointed at the quiet maid in the corner, the room froze. No one knew her past, not even the billionaire. What she was hiding would shake his empire and his heart. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button. Because tomorrow, we're bringing you another powerful story you won't want to miss. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above the marble-floored ballroom of the Ashcroft Foundation's annual charity gala. Guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos milled about, sipping champagne and offering sycophantic smiles to the hosts of the evening, Charles Ashcroft. He stood near the grand staircase, his gaze sweeping over the opulence he'd built with hard precision. Billionaire, CEO, widower. But tonight, Charles wasn't watching the guests. He was watching his son. 8-year-old Oliver Ashcroft stood near the ice sculpture, visibly stiff in a miniature tuxedo. His golden hair had been neatly combed, his shoes polished like mirrors, and yet his eyes, the same stormy gray as his late mother's, flicked anxiously around the room. The boy was restless. Charles clenched his jaw. Everything had been planned. His son would charm the board members, smile at the cameras, be the future. Instead, Oliver's shoulders hunched. A group of socialites fluttered around him like peacocks, cooing with artificial affection. One pinched his cheek. Another tried to offer him a foie gras canapé. Oliver's lip trembled. Charles took a step forward until he saw her. From the corner of the ballroom, a maid approached. Her uniform was modest, her dark hair neatly braided, her posture straight but unassuming. Mariana. She crouched beside Oliver, whispering something too soft to hear. The boy blinked, then nodded. A moment later, his lips curved upward. Not a practiced smile, not the rehearsed one Charles's assistants drilled him on. A real one. Warm, familiar. And with it, the tight coil in his little shoulders loosened. Charles froze. The women around them retreated awkwardly as the boy leaned into Mariana, who gently wiped a smudge from his cheek and straightened his bow tie. Her hand lingered for just a second on his shoulder. Protective. Natural. The room hadn't noticed the moment, but Charles had. He turned away, his face unreadable. "Everything all right, sir?" asked Martin, his head of security. Charles' voice was low. "Find out who she is." Martin followed his gaze. "The maid?" In the service hallway, Mariana quickly adjusted her tray of dirty glasses, her hands trembling just slightly. The gala had been overwhelming. She had only worked at the Ashcroft estate for 3 weeks, quietly cleaning guest rooms, kitchens, and now filling in for catering. She hadn't meant to approach the boy, but she'd seen it, the fear in his eyes, the panic bubbling just beneath. She'd known that look. Her younger brother used to have the same one before their mother walked out. "Maria," a soft voice piped behind her. She turned. "Oliver." He held a small napkin in his hand, a shaky drawing of a dog scribbled in pencil. "You said you liked dogs," he said, "so I drew you one." Mariana's heart twisted. She crouched again, eye level. "It's beautiful. Is it a golden retriever?" He nodded proudly. "That's the one I want, when I'm old enough to get one myself." She smiled. "Well, I hope he's just as kind as you are." Charles stepped into the hallway then, flanked by Martin. His presence shifted the air, the temperature, the silence. Oliver straightened, hiding the drawing behind his back. Inside, Charles said softly to his son. Oliver obeyed without question, but not before glancing back at Mariana with a look that spoke volumes. Trust, affection, something Charles hadn't seen from him in months. Once the boy was out of earshot, Charles turned to her. "You work in the house?" "Sir, housekeeping and general duties." "I'm new." "You calmed him," he said. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "I didn't say it was a problem," Charles cut in. "Most people can't get through to him when he's like that." "What did you say?" Mariana looked down. "I told him I used to get scared around strangers too. That it's okay not to like foie gras." Charles didn't laugh. He just studied her, like an equation he couldn't solve. You went off duty 10 minutes ago. You're free to go." Mariana nodded quickly and backed away, her face flushed. When she disappeared around the corner, Charles turned to Martin. "Everything. Background, references, who hired her?" Martin hesitated. "Sir, she came from the agency you approved. Background checks are clean." "Check again." Later that night, in the quiet of the estate library, Charles poured a scotch and sat alone beneath a portrait of his late wife, Amelia. Her features were delicate, her smile distant, captured forever in oils and memory. She had been everything he wasn't, warmth to his steel, laughter to his logic. When she died, something in him closed, shut lock tight behind spreadsheets and succession plans. Oliver had suffered for it. He knew that. Still, it wasn't emotion that made him think of Mariana. It was efficiency. The way she handled the moment. Her presence. Not loud, not showy, just steady. That mattered. He opened his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. She had no social media presence, no extended criminal record, no family listed, not even a photo online. He leaned back in his chair. Interesting. The next morning, Mariana arrived before dawn as usual, slipping through the staff entrance. She liked the early hours before the world buzzed with tasks and commands, before anyone noticed her. But that morning, as she passed through the main hallway, she stopped. On the central table was a breakfast tray, 2 plates, one small, one adult. A note in precise handwriting. "Join us on the patio. Mr. Ashcroft." She swallowed hard. Had she done something wrong? Or something too right? The sun had barely risen when Mariana stepped onto the Ashcroft penthouse patio. The air was cool and crisp, a gentle breeze drifting in from the city skyline that stretched beyond the glass balcony. She clutched her apron, heart pounding with every step. Charles Ashcroft sat at the outdoor dining table, his suit perfectly pressed despite the early hour. Next to him, swinging his legs beneath the chair, was Oliver. The boy grinned when he saw her. "You came," he chirped, holding up the empty chair beside him. Charles didn't speak right away. He simply gestured to the seat with a slight nod, as if testing her reaction. Mariana hesitated. This wasn't protocol. She was staff. Breakfast with the CEO and his heir? That wasn't written into any job description. Still, Oliver's eyes were pleading. She slowly took the seat. A housekeeper brought out a second tray of warm pancakes, placing it gently in front of her. Oliver was already halfway through his second bite, syrup on his cheek. Mariana reached for a napkin and wiped his face without thinking. Charles watched the interaction with a sharp gaze. "You've worked in the house for how long?" he asked. 3 weeks, sir." "You've had experience with children before." She nodded. "I used to help care for my younger brother. He was a handful." "Where is he now?" The question landed like a stone. Mariana's fingers froze around her fork. She lowered her gaze. "Hazed," she whispered. There was a long pause. "I'm sorry," Charles said, more quiet than expected. She gave a polite nod, but the walls around her heart began rebuilding themselves brick by brick. She couldn't let this become personal. It never ended well when it did. Oliver suddenly leaned over his plate. "Can I show her my model train later?" Charles raised a brow. "Only if she finishes her shift." Oliver turned to her. "Promise you'll come?" Mariah hesitated, then smiled faintly. "If I finish early, I'll stop by." She meant it as a gentle dismissal, but the boy beamed like she'd just promised him the moon. Charles leaned back in his chair. "You're not like the others." "I just do my job." "Tire? That's not what I meant." The intensity of his stare made her skin prickle. She dropped her gaze again. "Don't want special attention, Mr. Ashcroft?" He tilted his head. "Then don't draw it." The warning was subtle, almost kind, almost. She stood carefully, brushing invisible crumbs from her apron. "Thank you for breakfast, sir." Charles said nothing, but Oliver waved as she walked away. Later that afternoon, the mansion was bustling with post-gala cleanup. Mariana kept her head down, her movements efficient. Polishing silver, organizing glassware, folding linens, anything to distract her from the unsettling morning. The patio breakfast had felt like a test, and she had no intention of failing. She was loading trays into the kitchen when a familiar voice called her name. "Marianne?" It was Oliver again, running in with untied shoelaces and a sketch pad in hand. His cheeks were flushed, excitement written across his whole face. "You said you'd come see the trains?" "I'm still on shift," she reminded gently. "'Cause so weird." She sighed, then checked the clock. 10 minutes, maybe a quick visit wouldn't hurt. She followed him to the study, where a sprawling miniature train set was laid out across an entire table. Oliver launched into a full explanation of the train routes, bridges, and tunnels. Mariana listened, smiling at his enthusiasm. "Does your dad ever play with you here?" she asked. Oliver shrugged. "He says he's busy." There was no resentment in his voice, just quiet acceptance. Mariana crouched down, helping him fix one of the track connections. "Well, I think it's amazing." "Really?" She nodded. He leaned against her for a moment. Just a second, but it stayed with her longer than it should have. She didn't see Charles in the doorway. Not at first. But he was there, watching again. That evening, the senior housekeeper, Greta, pulled her aside. "Don't linger in the boys' room," she said, her voice sharp. "The last girl who got too friendly was gone by sunrise." Maria swallowed. "I didn't mean to. He asked me to see his trains." Greta crossed her arms. "Mr. Ashcroft doesn't like mess, especially emotional ones." Mariana nodded. Understood. But as she returned to her quarters, her thoughts wouldn't stop racing. She hadn't meant to bond with the boy, or to catch the CEO's attention. She only wanted a steady job, a quiet life. But something was happening, something unspoken. Charles sat alone in his office that night, reviewing spreadsheets with one hand while sipping espresso with the other. But his mind wasn't on the numbers. It was on her. The maid. Juliana. He'd seen dozens of employees come and go since Amelia died. Nannies, tutors, housekeepers. They stayed for a paycheck, not because they cared. But this one, she cared. Not in a cloying, performative way. Not for attention or approval. It was just in her nature. That was dangerous. And yet he couldn't ignore it. A soft knock came at the door. Martin entered with a file in hand. Her background check, updated. Charles opened it. A few notes stood out. Grew up in Queens, foster homes, no known family, previously worked at 2 residences, glowing reviews but no long-term attachments, no arrests, no college degree, no lawsuit. A ghost. He closed the file. Ghosts didn't stir his son's heart, and they didn't stir his. Unless they were something else entirely. The morning after the gala, Charles Ashcroft sat at the end of the long dining table, untouched toast on his plate and steam curling from his black coffee. The silence of the mansion was broken only by the distant clang of silverware being sorted in the kitchen. Across from him, Oliver poked at his eggs with a tiny fork, brow furrowed in uncharacteristic thought. "We have something for you." Oliver looked up, blinking flares gestured to the butler, who stepped forward as a small, leather-bound booklet in hand. He set it beside Oliver's plate. "What is it?" Oliver asked, voice barely louder than a whisper. "A list," Charles said crisply, "of suitable candidates, women who could become your new mother." Oliver's face froze, then twisted. "No." Charles' eyes narrowed. "This is not a decision for a child. It's not a toy, Papa," Oliver said quietly. "It's a mom." Charles straightened. "These women are educated, accomplished, elegant. They know how to navigate the life you're going to live." Oliver shook his head and pushed the list away. "I already know who I want." Charles looked at him for a long, incredulous beat. "You're 8?" Oliver reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of drawing paper. Crayons had etched out a shaky image, himself, Charles, and Mariana standing under a tree with a crooked heart above them. Mariana's dress was yellow, Oliver's name was scrawled beside hers, surrounded by stars. Charles stared at the drawing. He blinked once, then again. "You think you want the maid to be your mother?" Oliver nodded, suddenly brave. "She listens. She knows how I like my peanut butter toast. She doesn't wear perfume that makes me sneeze. She doesn't pretend to like me when people are watching. She just is." Charles didn't speak. His fingers closed tightly around the drawing, crumpling the paper ever so slightly. Eliza was too. Upstairs, later that day, Charles walked the halls like a man possessed. The memory of the gala flickered in his head. Mariana stepping forward with calm certainty, diffusing Oliver's tantrum like it was a breeze. She hadn't flinched, hadn't looked to him for permission. She had simply crouched and spoken, like Oliver was a boy and not a badge of status. That night, Charles asked for her employment file. It was thin, a single page with a name, a birth date, and a local address. No schooling, no previous positions, just references from the estate's head of housekeeping. Something wasn't right. Borden. The next morning, when Mariana stepped into the staff break room, she noticed immediately that her small belongings drawer had been disturbed. Her books weren't in the same order, her shawl was missing. Panic flared in her chest, but it was the absence of the small locket that sent her knees weak. She dug through the folded swimmer Reeve checked, her apron pockets twice. Then again, it wasn't there. Her breath quickened. That locket was all she had left, the only proof that once before, this life of scrubbing floors and polishing crystal, there had been another life. A life with color, a life with love. Inside that locket was a photo of her and her daughter. A photo that had faded with time, but not enough to erase the soft curls of the little girl's hair, or the half-smile she wore a lot. From the back pocket of his jeans came the pouch he had given her when she fled to her quarters and searched every inch. The drawers, the bed sheets, even under the rug. No to even provided her hands were trembling as she tried to fold linens in the laundry room. The other maids chattered around her, unaware of her. Then, suddenly, he appeared. Charles Ashcroft stood at the door. Silent, she turned, startled, the white sheet slipping from her fingers. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, and held out the locket. Her heart stopped. She stepped forward, slowly, warily, and took it from his outstretched hand. He didn't explain how he'd found it. He didn't offer an apology, but his gaze lingered on her face longer than it should have. Mariana's fingers closed tightly around the locket, and her breath came out in a shaky exhale. "Thank you," she said softly. Charles tilted his head slightly. "She looks like Oliver." Mariana froze. He had opened the locket. He had seen the photo. "She's not," Mariana started, but stopped herself, her jaw clenched. "That was a long time ago." "Who is she?" he asked, his voice low. Mariana looked up at him, searching his face for cruelty, for smugness. But instead, she saw something else, almost confused. "She was mine," Mariana said quietly. "That's all." Charles nodded once, then stepped back. "Oliver thinks the world of you." "I'm just a maid?" "No, you're not." Mariana's eyes widened, and then he left. She sank to the bench in the corner and sat there, clutching the locket to her chest. Her heart was pounding, not from fear but from something she hadn't felt in years, uncertainty. Not about what she had to do, but about what Charles Ashcroft might do next. In his office, Charles stared at the crayon drawings still tucked into his desk drawer. His son had chosen Mariana over all the pedigreed women on his list, and now, two photographs in the locket did look like Oliver. Too much, in fact. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, conflicted. There was something in Mariana's eyes, a story, one he didn't yet understand, one he suddenly wanted to, but he couldn't afford entanglements, not again. Yet, why couldn't he stop thinking about her? Downstairs, in the dim laundry room, Mariana wiped away a tear and whispered to herself, "Not again. I can't let it happen again." But fate, as always, had other plans. Days that followed were tense, silent, and strange. Charles didn't mention the locket again. He didn't ask Mariana any more questions, but she noticed things, subtle things. A flicker of his eyes when she passed him in the hallway, the way he paused when Oliver said her name, the fact that he stopped bringing up the list of socialites entirely. Instead, he watched the way she tied Oliver's scarf before school. Not too tight, not too loose. He watched how Oliver leaned into her touch without hesitation, how he laughed louder, played harder, and cried less when she was nearby. Maria pretended not to notice, but it gnawed at her. The way Charles loomed like a question she couldn't answer. His silence was heavier than any accusation, and the truth, her truth, was dangerous. So she kept her head down and worked. She stayed late, she scrubbed harder, she smiled through aching worry. Every time she glanced at her locket, now tucked deep in her apron pocket, she remembered the child in the photo. The soft brown eyes, the missing years, the ache of not knowing until one night, something shifted. It was just after dinner. Oliver had finished his homework early and asked Mariana to read him a bedtime story. Charles, seated in the study, overheard the request. "Mariana?" he called out unexpectedly. She hesitated. "I'd like to ask you something. About Oliver." Still cautious, she took the seat. He studied her. "He's happier lately." "I'm glad," she replied carefully. "You did that?" Mariana lowered her gaze. "Children need time, patience." Charles leaned forward. "You gave him more than that." She didn't answer, he continued, slower now. "I've had a dozen nannies, tutors, specialists. None of them could calm him like you do." "I don't do anything special." "You do," he said, voice firm, "and I need to know why." Mariana felt the heat rise in her chest. The question hovered between them, laced with danger. She clutched the sides of her skirt tightly, forcing calm into her voice. "I care for him," she said simply. "That's all." "Why?" Charles asked. It was more than curiosity, it was suspicion, fear, maybe even hope. Mariana stood suddenly. "If that's all, sir, I need to check the kitchen inventory." But as she turned to leave, he said something that made her freeze. "She could be his sister." Mariana slowly turned back. "What?" "The girl in your locket." She looked like Oliver. Same eyes, same smile. "Possible, is it?" Her throat tightened. "Yes." He stared at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "Why do I feel like you're lying to protect something?" "Because you're used to everyone lying to get something," she said, before she could stop herself. She winced, realizing too late what she'd just said. But Charles didn't look angry, he looked stunned. She quickly turned and walked out. That night, Mariana barely slept. Her chest was tight with panic. The photo, the resemblance. Had she made a mistake? Had she stayed too long? She sat on the edge of her bed, locket open in her palm. Her thumb brushed the tiny photo, her mind swirling with memories. Before the fire, before the fetish system, before she was labeled unfit. When love was simple and family wasn't a secret. She whispered to the darkness, "I'm not ready to lose him too." The next morning, Oliver was unusually quiet. He didn't ask for toast, he didn't tell silly jokes. Instead, he waited for Mariana in the hallway with his backpack already on. "Are you mad at Papa?" he asked. Mariana knelt beside him. "Why do you ask that?" "He looked upset after you talked." "Did he yell at you?" "Sweetheart, he just asked some questions." "About what?" She smiled softly. "About how wonderful you are." Oliver grinned and threw his arms around her neck. "You're the best. If Papa doesn't see that, he needs glasses." She laughed despite herself. Later that evening, Charles found Oliver in his room, drawing again. This time, the sketch was different. Just two people under a sky full of stars, himself and Mariana holding hands. He stared at it long after Oliver left the room. The next day, Charles didn't speak to Mariana at all. But that night, she found a small envelope slid beneath her bedroom door. Inside was a single card, embossed with the Ashcroft crest. Written in Charles's neat, rigid handwriting were 5 words. "Come to the study, midnight." Mariana stared at the card for a long time. At 11:59 p.m., she stood at his door. He was there, seated, a glass of untouched whiskey beside him, papers strewn across his desk. He didn't look up as she entered. "You said midnight," she said softly. He nodded. "I did." He pushed forward a file folder. "I did a background check." She tensed. I couldn't find anything before you turned 21, he said, lifting his gaze. That's rare. Her fingers curled into her palms. Who are you really? She didn't answer. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. You're not just a maid, and I think you know why Oliver chose you. I never told him to. No. That's what scares me. Silence again. Then Mariana stepped forward and opened the locket. She placed it gently on the desk, between them. It's my sister, she whispered. She was taken in a custody battle. I never saw her again. Charles blinked. Not your daughter? Mariana shook her head. We were in foster care. When the system split us up, I swore I'd find her. I took every job that let me search city records. I kept that photo to remember. He swallowed, voice low. You thought Oliver? I didn't know, she admitted. I still don't. But when I saw him, I felt it. Not just recognition, something deeper. Charles leaned back, shaken. And I didn't mean to get close to him, Mariana said. I just stayed 'cause he needed someone. Charles stared at her. Then, quietly, he asked, Why didn't you tell me? She gave him the truth. Because rich men like you don't believe poor girls like me. And I couldn't bear to lose him before I even knew if he was mine. Charles looked down at the photo. Mariana turned to leave. But he stopped her with just one word. The sun dipped low over the Ashcroft estate, casting a warm golden hue over the sculpted hedges and ancient stone pathways. The gardens were in full bloom, roses blushing pink, lilies whispering in the breeze. Yet the beauty of it all did nothing to soften the tension stretching between Mariana and Charles as they stepped out into the cool, late afternoon air. Charles had invited her for a walk. That was the word he used, but his tone made it sound like an interrogation. Mariana followed reluctantly, unsure whether to treat it like a job requirement or a personal reckoning. She kept a respectable distance, her hands folded in front of her apron, eyes lowered whenever he glanced her way. Charles walked with the air of someone accustomed to being listened to. He didn't bother to mask his intensity. Do you enjoy working here, Mariana? He asked, his voice smooth but edged. She blinked. Yes, sir. Wasn't what I asked. His eyes cut toward her. I asked if you enjoyed it. There's a difference. She hesitated. It's peaceful. The house has good bones, and Oliver is a remarkable boy. That made him stop. He turned to face her fully, arms crossed. Remarkable, yes, and yet you're the only one he hasn't driven away. Why is that? Mariana swallowed, feeling the sudden pressure in her throat. She met his gaze with quiet honesty. Because I don't treat him like a problem. I see him. Charles studied her, as if trying to decode something far more complex than words. Before he could respond, a small voice called out from behind. Wait for me. They both turned to see Oliver running toward them, arms flaring, hair a little messy, socks mismatched. He was clutching a crumpled leaf like it was treasure. I want to walk too, he panted, slipping between them without hesitation. He grabbed Mariana's hand on one side and reached for his father's on the other. Charles flinched. It had been years since Oliver had voluntarily touched him, and the warmth of that small hand was unexpectedly disarming. He let the boy take it. The three of them walked on, a strangely uneven triangle bound by tension, curiosity, and something unnamed. They strolled in silence for a while, Oliver humming tunelessly as he skipped over cracks in the stone. Charles finally spoke again, his voice lower now. Do you believe in legacy? Mariana's brow furrowed. In what way? In the way that what we build must outlast us, that family names mean something, that bloodlines carry weight. She considered her words carefully. I believe love is a better legacy than power, and that blood doesn't make you family. Loyalty does. Charles' jaw tightened. That sounds like something someone without a legacy would say. Mariana didn't reply. She didn't need to. The sting in his own words hung in the air between them. Oliver, still skipping, pointed to a fountain ahead. Can we sit there? Charles relented with a nod, and they settled at the marble edge of the old structure. The water danced in the sunlight, cool and melodic. Mariana helped Oliver up onto the stone ledge, brushing dirt from his knees. Charles watched her movements, gentle, deliberate, maternal. "You never answered my question," he said suddenly. "Which one? Why you're still here?" Mariana's eyes didn't leave Oliver. She smoothed his hair as she replied, "Because someone needed to be." Charles looked away, annoyed at how her simplicity disarmed him. Back inside the mansion later that evening, Mariana returned to the staff wing. Her room was tucked away near the service corridor, a modest space with thin walls, a creaky bed, and a single lamp on the nightstand. She closed the door behind her and sighed, letting her shoulders drop. But something was wrong. She turned toward her dresser. The drawer was slightly ajar. Panic seized her. Her fingers flew to the velvet pouch tucked beneath the old shirts. It was empty. Her breath hitched, her locket gone. She tore through the drawer, heart pounding, whispering prayers under her breath. That locket was everything. It held a photo of her and her daughter. Her daughter who... A knock at the door made her freeze, opened it cautiously, and there stood Charles, her locket, rested in his palm. "Apologized," he said curtly. "Your room was unlocked. I was looking for something else." Mariana stared at him, mute. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy," he added. "I returned it because it looked important." "It is," she said quietly, taking it back. Her fingers closed around it like a lifeline. "It's all I have left." Something flickered across his face, an emotion too fast to name. He turned to go, but paused at the threshold. "You don't wear it." She looked up, her voice tight. "Because it hurts?" He nodded once and walked away. Mariana closed the door, leaned her back against it, and finally let herself cry. That night, as silence blanketed the estate, she wandered down one of the hallways she rarely visited, toward the east wing. It was where Charles kept his private study, and where Oliver often played when he thought no one was watching. As she passed a narrow hallway, something caught her eye. A small alcove, once bare, was now covered with sheets of paper. Crayon drawings, some folded, some taped. Mariana stepped closer. Were Oliver's. A house with a big sun overhead. A picture of his mother, blonde, smiling, haloed by yellow, and beside that, a newer drawing. 3 figures. A man with dark hair and a suit. A little boy with wide eyes. A woman in a blue dress with a heart on her chest. They were holding hands. Beneath, scrawled in crooked letters, "My family." Mariana pressed her hand to her mouth. She stared for a long time. Then, slowly, quietly, she reached out and touched the corner of the drawing, slightly, as if afraid it would vanish. Mariana didn't sleep that night. Even after she returned to her room, she sat on the edge of the bed, locket in hand, staring blankly at the floor. Her fingers traced the edges of the heart-shaped pendant, the metal cool against her skin. The child in the photo, her daughter, had the same round cheeks, the same soft brown eyes as Oliver. It was impossible not to see echoes of her in him. She whispered a name into the darkness, one she hadn't spoken aloud in years. Then silence swallowed the room again. Across the mansion, Charles stood in front of his study window, drink in hand, watching the fog roll in from the hills. The lights of the gala still twinkled faintly in the distance, a reminder of the world he belonged to. The world he was expected to rule, uphold, defend. But all he could think about was that locket, that photo. The way Mariana's hand trembled when she took it back, the way her voice cracked when she said, "It's all I have left." There was grief in her eyes, barely concealed, and strength too, the kind of quiet resilience that made him pause, made him question. She had no pedigree, no wealth, no agenda. But she had Oliver's trust, and now, unknowingly, a grip on something inside him he didn't know could still respond. He glanced toward the shelf where Oliver's drawings were kept, most of them stored away after the boys' therapy sessions. But that one, the one of the 3 of them holding hands, he remembered seeing it earlier that week. His assistant had tucked it into a folder. Charles hadn't thought much of it then. Now he couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, the mansion was unusually quiet. The staff moved like ghosts. cleaning and dusting with practiced precision. Maria, despite her sleepless night, was already in the kitchen helping prepare breakfast. She kept her eyes down, her hands busy, as though avoiding eye contact could shield her from the shifting current she felt pulling through the air. "Harina," a voice said behind her. She turned, nearly dropping a plate. It was Charles. He stood tall, composed, his suit immaculate even this early. But something about his eyes had changed. They weren't cold, not today. "Please like you to join me in the garden after breakfast," he said. She blinked. "Sir?" "I won't ask twice." He turned and walked away. Later, when Oliver finished eating his pancakes and dashed off to the playroom, Mariana stepped hesitantly into the garden path once more. She spotted Charles near the roses, hands in his pockets, staring off toward the fountain they'd sat at the day before. She approached slowly. "Mr. Ashcroft, if this is about yesterday—" "It's not," he interrupted. "It's about today." She said nothing. He glanced at her. "You're not easy to read." "Not meant to be read," she said softly. He smirked at that. "You're clever." "I'm careful." They walked in silence again. This time the air felt different, less rigid, less transactional. "I saw the wall," she said after a moment. "The one with Oliver's drawings." He looked down, then nodded. "He started pinning them there himself. I thought it was clutter at first. My staff tried to take them down. He screamed so loud the neighbors heard." Mariana smiled faintly. "It's how he speaks, how he tells you what he's feeling." "I figured that out too late," Charles admitted. "I've been trying to mold him into someone he's not. But when I saw that drawing, the one with you in it, I realized something." She didn't speak, but her eyes asked the question. Edward cautioned. "He doesn't need a perfect mother," Charles said. "He needs someone who sees him." "You?" she asked, a little too bold. He looked at her. "I need someone who sees me too." That stopped her cold. She looked down at the pebbled path, unsure how to answer. Every instinct told her to retreat, to return to her role, to the safety of lines drawn clearly between master and maid. But there was a warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before, a vulnerability she'd never thought him capable of. "You don't have to explain yourself to me," she finally said. "Maybe I do," he replied. "I've spent years building walls so high that even Oliver has to climb just to reach me. But you—" He broke off, shaking his head. "I didn't ask to be the exception," she said gently. They walked a bit more, their steps softer now, more in rhythm. When they reached the archway covered in ivy, Charles paused. "I read your file," he said quietly. Mariana tensed. "It wasn't much, just your work history, a few notes, nothing personal." She exhaled slowly. "That's by design." He turned to face her fully. "But I'd like to know you, not as staff, not as a checklist for Oliver. As you." She stepped back. "I don't know if I can give you that." "Because of what's in the locket?" She flinched. He held up a hand. "I won't ask. Not unless you're ready." Her eyes met his, guarded but grateful. "I just wanted you to know," he added, "that whatever story you carry, it doesn't scare me." Mariana nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "It scares me." That night, as the mansion lights dimmed and the staff retired to their quarters, Charles found himself in Oliver's room, watching his son sleep. The boy clutched a new stuffed bear Mariana had repaired the week before. His breathing was soft, even the bed of the bed, and looked around. The drawings had multiplied. There were more of Mariana, one of her hugging Oliver, one of her and Charles standing side by side at the fountain, and one, folded in half, tucked between the books on the shelf. He pulled it out. One was different. A castle drawn in blue crayon, a heart above it. Inside the heart, 3 stick figures holding hands. Underneath, Oliver had written something clumsy but unmistakable. Charles' throat tightened. Somehow, without permission, without socialite bloodlines or corporate negotiations, that maid had slipped into their world and made it warmer. He folded the drawing back and placed it in his breast pocket. For the first time in a long time, he smiled. Dinner at the Ashcroft estate was rarely anything short of orchestrated elegance. Tables were laid like stages, silverware aligned to perfection, crystal glasses catching light like chandeliers. But that night, one seat at the massive oak table remained conspicuously empty. Charles Ashcroft sat at the head, arms crossed, a low hum of classical music echoing in the background. His fingers tapped once, twice, against the dark mahogany before he exhaled and gestured to the butler. "I refused?" The butler nodded. "Yes, sir," politely. Charles' jaw clenched. He wasn't used to refusals, especially not from someone whose employment contract technically gave him the power to command presence. But this was different. This wasn't business. It wasn't even formality. He'd sent the invitation himself, handwritten. That alone had startled the staff. And yet Mariana had said no. Upstairs, Oliver pouted on his bed, arms crossed like a miniature version of his father. Mariana stood by the bookshelf, helping him pick out a bedtime story. "She's coming, right?" he asked. Mariana sighed softly. "Not tonight, sweetheart." "He wants you." She hesitated. "It's complicated." Oliver stared at her, then jumped off the bed and ran out of the room. "Oliver," she called after him, but he was already down the hallway. By the time Charles heard the hurried footsteps, it was too late. Oliver burst into the dining hall, eyes wide, voice loud enough to startle the servers. "Wine, why can't she come?" Charles turned, surprised by his son's sudden appearance. "Oliver, this isn't—" "I don't want to eat if she's not here," the boy declared. "She's part of our family now." Mariana arrived seconds later, breathless, cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Breathed mentally. "Sorry, sir. I didn't mean—" Charles raised a hand to stop her. He looked at his son, then at her. And then he said, "Join us." Mariana blinked. I can't. I'm the maid." Charles' voice softened. "Tonight, you're our guest." Oliver beamed. Mariana looked down at her simple uniform, then back up at the towering man who moments ago had seemed carved from stone. Slowly, hesitantly, she stepped forward. Dinner began with silence. The clinking of forks on porcelain was the only sound. Mariana sat across from Charles, Oliver between them, chatting about his day, what book he read, which bird he saw in the garden. Mariana nodded, listening intently. Charles observed her more than he listened. Her movements were precise, respectful. She took small bites, barely touched the wine. "Did you always want to work with children?" Charles asked suddenly. Mariana looked up, startled by the question. "Not always?" "You're good at it." "Thank you," she said, setting her fork down. "I suppose kindness is something you don't train for." Charles tilted his head. Some would argue kindness has no place in legacy building. Mariana's eyes didn't flinch. "Then perhaps we're building the wrong kind of legacy." The air tightened. Oliver kept chewing, oblivious. Charles smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You speak like someone who's lost something." "Have," she replied softly. He didn't press. A pause stretched between them, not hostile, but weighty. She reached for her water. "You don't drink?" he asked, noting the untouched wine. "I stopped," she said, voice calm but firm. "It reminds me of a time I no longer belong to." Charles nodded once, absorbing the words without pushing further. Memories can haunt or teach. Sometimes they do both. Outside, the wind picked up, and the large windows shivered slightly in their frames. Charles leaned forward. "You intrigue me, Mariana." She froze. "Because I refused your invitation?" she asked. "Because you see my son," he replied. "And you don't seem afraid of me." "I am," she admitted, "but not in the way you think." He waited. "I'm afraid of what happens when people get too close to power," she continued. "They lose who they are." "You're trying not to lose yourself." "I already did once. I'm not eager to repeat it." Charles's gaze didn't waver. "What if you didn't have to lose yourself? What if someone could meet you exactly where you are?" For a moment, Mariana didn't breathe. Then Oliver giggled, his spoon knocking against his bowl. "You're both talking weird," he said. They laughed. The tension cracked. Later, after dessert, warm apple tart with vanilla cream, Oliver grew sleepy. Charles excused him, and one of the nannies escorted him to bed. Mariana stood to leave too, but Charles stopped her. "Stay, just a moment." She hesitated, then sat again. The fire in the hearth glowed low, casting amber shadows across the room. Charles poured them both tea, not wine, she noticed. "I'm not used to this," she said, watching the flames. Being seen. He sipped. "You should be." They fell quiet again. This time, it wasn't uncomfortable. "You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago," he said. She looked at him. They had nothing to her name but dignity, raised her siblings, sacrificed everything. She ended up marrying someone who never saw her. Mariana swallowed. "Did you?" Charles smiled faintly. "I was too late." She turned back toward the fire. "People like me aren't meant to sit at tables like this. Maybe the table needs someone like you." Silence again. Then Mariana stood. "I should go." Charles didn't stop her this time, but as she turned to leave, he said, "You're not just the maid." She paused, hand on the chair's back. "That's what I tell myself when it gets too hard," she whispered. And then she walked out, leaving him staring into the fire, unsure if he'd just let something important slip through his fingers. The hallway outside the dining room was hushed, dimly lit by golden sconces. Mariana walked briskly, trying to steady her breath. Her pulse still raced from the conversation. Charles Ashcroft had a way of making the air feel heavier, like every word exchanged with him carried double meaning. It wasn't just about power, it was about... She reached her room, hands trembling slightly as she shut the door behind her. Her reflection stared back at her in the small vanity mirror, eyes wide, lips parted, unsure whether to cry or laugh. She had shared more at that dinner table than she'd planned. And Charles had listened. Truly listened. She pressed her back to the door and closed her eyes. "I'm just the maid," she had told him. But the way he'd looked at her, that pause, that silence, had said otherwise. In the west wing of the mansion, Charles poured himself another cup of tea, ignoring the untouched wine. The firelight danced over his features, softening the usual stern lines on his face. He leaned back in the chair, thinking of her words, her gaze, the sadness she didn't try to hide. Her strength wasn't in what she said, but in what she chose not to say. He found himself wondering about the life she'd left behind. What had broken her? What had taught her how to soothe Oliver better than any trained professional ever had? Upstairs, Oliver stirred in his sleep. He murmured Mariana's name, clutching a small, stuffed bear she'd sewn back together weeks ago. When the wind howled through the balcony door, he didn't wake. Not yet. Mariana finally removed the apron she still wore over her dress. She placed it gently on the dresser, then sat on the edge of her narrow bed, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. The locket hung heavy around her neck. She pressed it to her lips. She thought about the moment Charles had returned it after she'd panicked when it disappeared. He hadn't asked questions. He hadn't mocked the photo. He'd simply looked at her, really looked, and handed it back. And that silence had spoken louder than any interrogation. But she couldn't let herself hope. Hope had cost her too much already. Upstairs, Charles rose and moved toward the hallway, as if drawn by some invisible thread. He didn't understand why her presence unsettled him. Perhaps it was because she never asked for anything. In his world, people always wanted something: deals, influence, positions, but not her. She just wanted to be left alone, until Oliver had changed everything. He turned toward the drawing room, where Oliver often left his crafts strewn about. Something caught his eye. Pinned to the side of the bookshelf, beside sketches of the garden and the family dog, was a newer drawing, still damp with glue. It showed 3 stick figures. One had short black lines for hair and a tie. One had long brown hair and a blue dress. The smallest stood between them, holding both their hands. Above it, in crayon, "My family, Oliver." Charles stared at it for a long time. 1,000 boardroom battles had never prepared him for this moment. When Mariana passed through the hallway the next morning, on her way to prepare Oliver's breakfasts, she paused. Something had changed. The energy in the mansion felt different, softer, quieter. Or maybe it was just her heart that had shifted. As she reached the drawing room, she stopped abruptly. Her eyes widened. There it was, taped to the wall, in full view. Oliver's drawing. Her, Charles, Oliver, together. It shouldn't have shaken her. Children were imaginative. They drew things they wished for. But this felt like prophecy, like danger. She stood frozen, staring, when Charles entered behind her. A few days later, she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Show me either," Charles replied quietly. She turned slowly. Their eyes met, and in them a fragile truth neither could voice. "But isn't right," she murmured. "Feels right," he said, softer than she'd ever heard him speak. "What makes it dangerous?" Charles didn't argue. He didn't press. Instead, he nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of boundaries, of fears, of the line they had both stepped too close to. "I'll ask someone else to handle his breakfast," Mariana said, turning away. Charles caught her wrist, not forcefully, just a touch. "You don't need to go," he said. But Mariana didn't stay. She walked away, the soft pads of her shoes silent on the polished floor, her figure retreating like a shadow returning to its corner. That night, Charles sat alone by the fire again. He no longer felt certain of anything. It's not his legacy, not his plan for Oliver, and especially not the woman who had come into his life like a whisper and now haunted every thought. Back in her room, Mariana opened her notebook, the old one with the frayed leather spine. Inside were pages of lists, places, names, addresses long since crossed out. Dead ends. Her handwriting was careful, precise. She stared at the last name on the most recent page, but she couldn't focus. All she could think of was the way Charles had looked at her, not with judgment, but with recognition. She hated it, because part of her wanted to look back. She closed the notebook and tucked it under her pillow, the locket pressed against her chest like a stone. In the silence, she whispered, "Don't let me break again." The wind outside answered with a low, mournful sigh. The morning air in the Ashcroft estate was unusually quiet. No birdsong outside the tall windows, no bustling kitchen noise, no laughter from Oliver echoing through the halls. The stillness was unnerving. Charles sat at the head of the long dining table, alone, nursing his black coffee as if it were war rations. The butler, James, approached hesitantly, holding a folded newspaper. "Sir," he said carefully, placing it beside the untouched croissant. "Page 6. Charles didn't move at first. Then he unfolded the paper with a flick, his fingers tightening as his eyes scanned the page. There, in bold capital letters and glossy ink, CEO full of promise. Inside the house, the instant Ballhouse jumped out of the images. Just below it, a blurry image. Mariana, stepping out of the side entrance, her expression soft, tired. Charles, behind her, his hand caught mid-reach. His jaw clenched. He stood so fast the chair screeched backward. Did they get this? His voice was quiet, controlled, dangerous. James cleared his throat. It appears someone on the inside may have spoken to the press. Charles's eyes were burning now, not with embarrassment but betrayal. The only person close enough for that photo. He stormed through the halls without a word, past the startled housekeeper, past the terrified cook, and toward the east wing. He didn't knock. He didn't pause. Mariana was folding Oliver's tiny socks when the door slammed open. "You leaked it," Charles growled. Mariana turned, startled. "What?" "You leaked it to the tabloids. You used me. Used him." Her mouth dropped open. "I would never—" With empathy. His voice cracked through the room like a whip. "That photograph, that headline. You played the quiet, innocent maid, but this was your plan all along. Gain sympathy, manipulate my son. Mean going to the police? Maria stepped back, as if slapped. That's not true. You think I'm a fool? Anything you're angry, and grieving, and blind to anything that doesn't fit the world you've built. Charles froze. The words hung in the air between them. She took a deep breath, her eyes glistening, but steady. You want the truth, Charles? Fine, here it is. She walked to her dresser, pulled open a drawer with trembling hands, and retrieved a small wooden box. Inside was a stack of old-school photos, newspaper clippings, and a worn-out letter. She handed him the top photo. A woman, her smiling beside a little girl with dark curls and dimples. Daughter, she whispered. Her name was Clara. Charles stared at the photo. I thought I was a maid with no past, Mariana said bitterly. I was a teacher, 4th grade. I loved it. She sat down, as if the weight of what she was about to say could no longer be carried standing. He is a boy in my class. He'd been bounced around foster homes, angry, isolated. But I didn't give up on him. I stayed late. I gave him books. I made sure he ate. Her voice cracked. One night, I found him in the hallway with matches. He said he wanted to watch the world burn. I told the principal. They said he needed more attention, but not to make a report, afraid of scaring off donors. Charles had gone still. Weekend, our apartment caught fire. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He watched from across the street. Charles swallowed, the photo still trembling in his hand. I lost Clara, in the smoke, in the silence that followed. The school denied everything, said I was confused by grief, that I'd made up the warning. Her eyes met his. I left everything behind, changed my name, took the first job I could find. Anything quiet, anything that didn't involve children. She exhaled, and then I met Oliver. The silence that followed was suffocating. Charles's voice, when it returned, was hoarse. Why didn't you tell me? Because people like you don't listen, she said, standing now, her eyes sharp. You see positions, titles, resumes. You don't see people. She gathered her things in slow, deliberate movements. Where are you going? He asked, a strange desperation threading through his voice. Already stayed too long. Oliver appeared at the doorway, clutching his toy lion. Where are you going, Miss Mariana? She knelt down, forcing a smile. Somewhere new, sweet boy. His eyes brimmed with tears. But why? She touched his cheek gently. Because sometimes grown-ups break things they don't know how to fix. Charles stepped forward. Oliver? She said, rising. Let him feel it. He should know what losing someone feels like. Charles stared at her. You think this is easy for me? And replied. But you made it cruel. She brushed past him. At the front doors, the staff watched in silence, mourning in their eyes. Oliver cried out, trying to run after her, but Charles stopped him, his hand trembling against his son's chest. The heavy gate closed behind her. And inside, all that remained was the cold echo of what could have been. The silence after Mariana's departure stretched like a wound across the Ashcroft estate. Oliver hadn't spoken all morning. He sat curled up on the velvet armchair in the sunroom, still in his pajamas, staring out at the garden where he used to play. His toy lion was clenched in his arms, fraying at the ear. The household staff tiptoed around him, unsure what to say or do. Even James, the ever-stoic butler, had softened his footsteps. Charles watched from the hallway, powerless. The article had vanished from the press after his legal team moved quickly. But it didn't matter. The damage wasn't public. It was personal. He replayed the confrontation over and over. His accusations, her shaking voice, the photograph of her daughter, the story of the fire. A child lost, a woman burned in silence. He had read every tabloid scandal in his career with detached amusement, used them to fuel business maneuvers, twist deals, leak distraction when it suited him. But this headline had broken something sacred. She hadn't fought for her reputation. She hadn't demanded forgiveness. She had simply walked away. And now Oliver was breaking, one quiet second at a time. By evening, Charles sat at his study desk, surrounded by untouched reports. Financial figures blurred in front of him. The silence was louder than any boardroom storm he'd ever weathered. Then came the knock. He looked up to find Oliver standing in the doorway, eyes rimmed with red. "She's not coming back, is she?" the boy asked. Charles hesitated. "Not right now." Oliver stepped into the room slowly, like every inch was made of glass. "Was it because of me?" The question struck Charles like a blow to the chest. He said quickly, rising from his chair, "No, Oliver, this wasn't your fault." "Then why did you yell at her?" The boy's voice trembled. "Why did you say mean things? She was nice. She helped me sleep again. She never told me to be someone else." Charles dropped to one knee, meeting his son's eyes. "I was wrong." Oliver's mouth quivered. "I told you I wanted her. Not the ladies from the paper, just her." "No? Then why didn't you listen?" Charles couldn't answer, not with words. Oliver climbed onto his lap without waiting for permission. He leaned into his father's chest and whispered, "I want her back." Charles closed his eyes. For the first time in years, the businessman didn't have a strategy, a contract, or a press statement to fix this. He only had silence. Regret. Mariana stood in the small, furnished room she'd rented in the city. The walls were bare, the window overlooked an alley, and the bed squeaked when she sat on it. But it was quiet, and most importantly, it was nowhere near the Ashcroft estate. She hadn't unpacked. Her suitcase still sat near the door, untouched. The locket rested on the bedside table, its chain glinting under the lamp. She opened it slowly, revealing the tiny photo of Clara. The girl's smile was wide, the curls wide, her eyes bright with laughter that now only lived in memory. Mariana swallowed hard. She had survived losing a child, survived the press, the shame, the guilt. She had rebuilt piece by piece. But this was something different. Charles Ashcroft had seen her, truly seen her, and then accused her of the very betrayal she'd spent her life avoiding. And Oliver, sweet, tender Oliver. She missed him more than she expected. Missed the way he'd tug on her apron just to tell her a joke. Missed his laughter, his insistence on bedtime stories, the light that had started to return to his eyes. She reached for her phone. No messages. No missed calls. Good, she told herself. Guess was how it had to be. Still, she stared at the screen long after the light had gone dim. 2 days passed. Then 3. On the 4th morning, a knock came at her apartment door. She froze, heart thudding. When she opened it, a young courier stood holding a large envelope. "Delivery for Mariana Alvarez," he said. She hesitated, then took it. Once inside, she opened it slowly. Inside were 2 things: a legal document and a letter. The legal document was a retraction order, signed and sealed by Ashcroft's legal team, sent to every outlet that had printed the rumor. At the bottom, a handwritten note from Charles. It was the only part I could undo. The rest, I wish I could. She stared at it for a long time, unsure whether the sting in her chest was pain or relief. Then she unfolded the letter. "Mariana, you told me I was blind to anything that didn't fit my world. You were right. But since you left, nothing fits. Oliver cries for you in his sleep. The house is silent again. I can't promise to fix everything, but I can start by saying this. I believe you. And I'm sorry. Cheryl." Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. She held the letter to her chest. Not as forgiveness, but as something closer to understanding. Back at the estate, Charles stood by the fireplace, Oliver fast asleep on the couch nearby. He watched the flames crackle, unsure what the next day would bring. He didn't know if she would come back. But for the first time, he hoped without strategy. He hoped with heart. And far away, in a small apartment, a woman stared out her window, holding a letter that might one day become the beginning of something she never thought she'd feel again. Second chance. It began with a fever. Oliver's body burned, his forehead slick with sweat, his breathing shallow and ragged beneath the heavy silence of his bedroom. The doctor came within the hour. Charles stood rigid at the foot of the bed as the man examined his son with professional calm, issuing words like infection and stress-induced complications. But it was Oliver's barely whispered plea that struck Charles deeper than any diagnosis. I just want her. Not anyone else. His son wasn't crying. He was too weak for that. But his voice held the fragile weight of a heart too small to carry so much grief. The boy had stopped eating, barely spoken, and now his body was mirroring the ache in his soul. Charles stood still long after the doctor left, watching the rise and fall of Oliver's chest. The empire he'd built, the towers, the holdings, the press, the fortune. None of it mattered now. Not if it meant watching the one person he loved most wither from sorrow he had caused. He sank into the leather chair beside the bed, elbows on his knees, face in his hands. He had failed, as a father, as a man, and maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to fix it. Charles hadn't stepped outside the estate alone in years. There was always a driver, always an assistant, always a plan. But that morning, with a hastily scrawled note to his assistant and no itinerary, he took his car and drove himself into the city. He didn't go to the office. He didn't even call ahead. He just followed instinct. The shelter was tucked within an old post office and a laundromat. A crooked, hand-painted sign read, Haven Hearts. There was no valet, no security, just chipped bricks and a warm scent of soup wafting from inside. He wasn't sure what he expected. But he hadn't expected to see her leaning beside a boy in tattered sneakers, helping him tie his shoe with a quiet smile. She wore a faded denim jacket and had her hair pulled back in a loose braid. There were no maid's uniforms here, no polished surfaces. Just her, kind, present, real. His breath caught in his throat. She didn't see him at first. He stood there, frozen, watching as she handed the boy a small cup of cocoa and rose to her feet. When their eyes finally met, everything stilled. Her expression didn't soften. Hardened, she walked toward him, slowly, each step deliberate. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her eyes were unfocused. "I'm not lost." Her voice wasn't cruel, but it was firm, like a door closing gently, not slammed, but undeniably closed. He cleared his throat. "Oliver's sick." Her posture faltered slightly. "What?" "He's not eating, barely sleeping. He asked for you?" The storm behind her eyes softened, but only for a second. "And you?" she asked. "I needed to tell you I was wrong, about everything." Silence stretched between them. He tried again. "I don't want you back as a maid." "But then what?" she challenged. "As what? A distraction? A redemption project?" "As someone I respect, as someone Oliver needs, and maybe someone I need too." She crossed her arms. "You saw my past as dirt." He stepped closer, his voice quieter now. "I see it as gold." Her eyes searched his face, scanning for lies. "You don't expect forgiveness," he added. "I just wanted to say it, to your face, without the mansion, without the name." Behind them, a group of children giggled, chasing each other around folding tables. Mariana glanced at them, then back at him. "You left Oliva without me," she said, "and now that it's inconvenient, you show up." He didn't answer right away. She sighed. "You don't get to fix this with words, I know," he whispered. "Then, please, just come for him." Her jaw tensed. Then slowly she nodded. "Not to him." Oliver knocked. "Charles, don't worry. You okay?" But for the boy whose lion she had sewn back together, whose nightmares she had soothed, whose smile had once made her believe in life again. "I'll pack my bag," she said simply. And just like that, she walked past him, not toward him, but back into the shelter to grab her things. He didn't follow. Because, now he understood, chasing her didn't mean cornering her. Hoping, and respecting her pace. Drive back to the estate was... Mariana sat in the passenger seat, hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the blur of trees and streetlights outside. Charles didn't speak. Neither did she. There were no words for what sat between them, only the sound of tires on pavement and the low hum of the engine. The silence wasn't cold anymore, just cautious. Fragile, like two people tiptoeing across cracked ice, trying not to fall through. When they arrived at the estate, the butler opened the front door, surprised but not bold enough to question her return. Mariana stepped inside, and the familiar scent of lemon polish and roses hit her like a memory too soon revisited. She paused at the foot of the staircase. "His fever broke this morning," Charles said behind her, quietly, "but he still hasn't spoken much." Mariana nodded, then she climbed the stairs. Logan. She pushed the door to Oliver's room open slowly. The lights were dim, the curtains drawn, and there he was, curled in a tight little ball beneath his blankets, clutching the stuffed lion she had repaired months ago. It looked even more worn now, but still held together by the careful stitches of her hands. "Oliver," she whispered. His head shot up. A second, he blinked, unsure if he was dreaming. And then, with a cry, he threw back the covers and launched into her arms. "Mariana," his voice cracked, but it was full of light again. "You came back." She held him tightly, tears rushing to her eyes as she rocked him gently. He clung to her, his little arms wrapped fiercely around her neck. "Missed you so," he said. "They said maybe you'd never come back." "I'll never leave you again," she whispered, burying her face in his hair. Charles stood quietly in the hallway, unseen. He didn't interrupt, he didn't step inside. He simply watched, as his son's color returned, as his tiny shoulders relaxed in the arms of the only woman who had ever truly understood him. It was the most painful and beautiful thing Charles had ever seen. And it wasn't his to interrupt. That evening, Mariana sat at the edge of the garden with Oliver, watching the koi in the pond. Charles joined them, hesitant. Oliver pulled him down to sit beside them. For a while, they didn't speak. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting everything in golden shadow. Then Charles turned to Mariana. "Will you stay?" She glanced at Oliver. "As staff," Charles clarified. "Not on payroll. I want you to stay as part of this family, or whatever we grow into." Mariana's voice was soft but steady. "You can't erase what you said, what you assumed." "I know," he said, "and I can't ask you to forget it, but I can ask for a chance to show you who I really am. Now." She didn't answer immediately. She reached for Oliver's hand. "I came back for him," she said. "That hasn't changed? But what about you?" Charles asked. "What do you want?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in years. Did she want? Not a title, not a mansion. Pity asked, "So who took the Syrian wife?" He looked between them, father and son, and something inside her shifted. "I want peace," she said finally. "And to be seen, really seen." Roy said, "Now, I swear it." "You are." Later that night, after Oliver had gone to sleep wrapped in dreams and lion fur, Charles met Mariana in the hallway outside his son's room. He held something in his hand. It was the locket. She blinked in surprise. "I found it again," he said, pressing it into her palm. "I had a copy made, for myself, if that's okay." She opened it. The tiny photograph still inside, her and the daughter she'd lost. The girl who looked so much like Oliver, it made her ache. "I used to think showing weakness was dangerous," Charles said quietly, "but I'm learning that not showing it cost me more." She looked at him. "I can't promise you perfection," he said, "but I can promise you truth and time." She nodded. Then, with trembling fingers, she opened the locket wider and tucked inside a new photo. One of Oliver, smiling, arms thrown around both of them from a moment long ago in the garden. She clicked it shut. This was her beginning again. Not for status, not for survival, for healing, for family, and maybe, just maybe, for herself. The elevator doors opened to a hush, the soft, golden wash of twilight filtering through the glass dome above. The rooftop garden wasn't just a patch of green on steel. It was a world of its own. Vines climbed lattices, flowers bloomed in curated chaos, and small lanterns Charles had never brought anyone up here since its completion. The space had been his shrine to mourning, his fortress of solitude. But now, with Oliver's small hand gripping Mariana's and her uncertain steps beside them, it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt open. "Where are we here?" Mariana asked softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Her dress was simple, still touched with flour from an afternoon baking with the kitchen staff. Yet to Charles, she looked like light itself. "I want you both to see something," he said, his voice quieter than usual. He wasn't commanding, he wasn't cold, just a man. Oliver released Mariana's hand and ran forward, laughing, as he found a small bench shaped like a lion. "This place is magic," he cried. Charles watched him for a moment, then turned to Mariana. "I built this for her, for Evelyn." Mariana looked at him, startled. "Your wife?" He nodded. "I was drowning in silence, in grief. I thought if I built something beautiful, it would be enough to keep the pain at bay. But even in all of this," he gestured to the lush expanse, "I stayed alone." Mariana's gaze drifted across the garden. "It is beautiful, but it's cold too." His lips twitched. "Until you walked into our lives, everything was—" There was a pause. The wind moved through the leaves like a whisper. The sound of Oliver humming filled the silence. Mariana's hands fidgeted at her sides. "You don't owe me this, Charles. I'm not—" He stepped forward, gently cutting off her words. "You are, whether you believe it or not." She blinked, her breath catching. He reached into his pocket. The moment felt suspended. "I found this months ago. After the fire," he unfolded a hand. Nestled in his palm was a ribbon, faded pink with singed edges. It was delicate, trembling in the breeze. "I didn't know whose it was at the time, but I kept it." Ailey gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. "That was Clara's. It was in her hair the day she—" Her voice said, "I know." His voice was steady, reverent. "I found it among the rubble. I didn't know why I kept it. Maybe guilt, maybe instinct." She stared at it, and tears welled in her eyes. "You kept it safe?" He stepped closer. "When I saw Oliver drawing you, hugging you, when I saw how he smiled again after months of silence, I started to wonder if maybe this place could be more than a memorial." Mariana swallowed hard. Her chest rose and fell, eyes fixed on the ribbon, as if it held her daughter's laughter inside. "I used to think legacy meant buildings and headlines," Charles continued. "But now, I think legacy might just mean the way a child says goodnight, the way a woman who lost everything still knows how to love." Her tears fell freely now, but she didn't turn away. He took a knee, not in the grand gesture of a proposal, but with humility, reverence. His palm opened again, not with a ring, but with the ribbon lying across his skin. "I'm not asking for promises. I'm not asking for forever, not yet. I'm asking if you'll help me build a home, one where love doesn't have to hide behind roles or wounds." Mariana stared at him, her soul cracked open. She had run from this kind of openness for so long, thinking it unsafe, thinking it would betray her again. But here, in this rooftop Eden, with the sound of Oliver singing and the ghost of her daughter dancing through the petals, it didn't feel dangerous. It felt real. She knelt beside him. Her hand didn't take the ribbon. It covered his. "I don't know if I can be that brave again," she whispered, "but I want to try." Charles closed his fingers around hers. "That's all I've ever needed." Island of ran over, just as the silence settled between them. He flung his arms around both Mariana and Charles without hesitation, giggling as he squeezed tightly. "Did I miss something?" he asked, his voice bright, innocent, unaware of the storm that had just calmed in the air around them. Mariana wiped her cheeks, her hands still resting in Charles's. "No, sweetheart," she said softly, pulling him close. "You brought us here. That's all that matters." Oliver beamed and plopped himself down on the grass between them. "This is my favorite place now, even better than the lion bench. You both should come here with me every day. Promise?" Charles ruffled his hair. "Promise, kiddo." Mariana smiled. "We'll make it our place." The moment was quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. not aching or heavy, peaceful, shared. Charles stood, brushing off his knees, and held his hand out to Mariana. She took it. Together, they helped Oliver up. The three of them stood under the golden dusk, the skyline glittering like diamonds behind them. "I was going to name this garden Evelyn's Rest," Charles murmured, "but I think it needs a new name." Oliver clapped. Let me pick. Mariana laughed, a sound that Charles hadn't realized he missed until it filled the air again. "What would you name it?" Oliver scrunched his nose, thinking. Then he shouted, "Mariana's garden." She froze. "Oh, no." Charles cut in. "It's perfect," she whispered, shaking her head, overcome. "It's too much. I was just a maid." "You were never just anything," Charles said, his voice firm but tender. "You've become the roots of this house." She looked at him, stunned, and slowly nodded. They stayed up there until the stars peeked out. Charles called the chef to send up warm cocoa and blankets, and Oliver insisted on stargazing on a patch of grass with his head in Mariana's lap. She stroked his hair, humming quietly. Charles sat beside them, sipping from a mug, watching them like a man who finally knew what peace felt like. Then softly, Mariana whispered, "Tell me about her, about Evelyn." Charles hesitated. It wasn't a name he spoke often, but something about this night felt sacred, so he did. He told Mariana about Evelyn's laugh, her strength, her fierce ideas, how she used to plant daisies in the snow just to defy nature, how she used to make fun of his ties and kiss him before every meeting for luck. "I built this place thinking I was preserving her," he said, "but I was just freezing myself." "Now," Mariana asked gently, "now I want to live again, not just for Oliver, for all of us." She looked down at Oliver, fast asleep in her lap, his hand still gripping the hem of her shirt. "He deserves that. So do you." They sat in silence for a while longer, the city lights blinking around them like stars trying to listen. Eventually, Charles reached into his coat pocket again, this time producing a small, velvet pouch. He didn't open it, just set it beside her on the blanket. She raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "I don't want you to open it tonight," he said. "Not until you're ready." Mariana stared at it. "Is it a ring?" he said with a soft smile. "It's a promise that if you ever want more, I'll be here, not waiting, but ready." She nodded slowly, the gesture reverent. "Okay." The wind picked up slightly, and Charles stood. "Let's take him inside." He reached down, lifting Oliver gently into his arms. Mariana stood beside him, walking slowly, matching his steps as they made their way back to the elevator. As the doors slid open and the warm interior lights bathed them, Charles turned to her. "Mariana?" She glanced up. "For staying." Her gaze softened. "Thank you for letting me." As the elevator descended, the world outside the glass shifted. City to mansion, rooftop garden to polished marble. But something in both of them had already changed. Whatever was growing between them now had roots. And this time, no fire could take it away. The morning sun streamed through the tall glass windows of the Ashcroft estate, now softer, warmer. Gone were the days of silence and stiff routine. Laughter echoed from the kitchen, footsteps down the halls, and the scent of pancakes wafted into every corner. Mariana stood at the stove, flipping the last golden pancake onto a plate stacked high. Her hair was tucked loosely into a bun, apron tied over a navy silk robe, no longer a uniform of servitude, but a life chosen, earned. Behind her, Oliver sat at the counter, swinging his legs, scribbling something on a large sheet of paper. His tongue peeked from the corner of his mouth, concentration fierce as he added final strokes to a bright yellow sun and a wide green lawn. "Small," he said without looking up. The word landed softly. Mariana still paused every time he said it, her chest tightening with quiet joy. "A sweetheart? Does this look like the garden?" He turned the paper toward her, revealing 3 stick figures. One with a long braid, another tall and square-shouldered, and the smallest holding both their hands beneath a sunny sky. Above them floated a heart, drawn in red crayon. She walked over, her eyes misting. "It's perfect," she whispered, brushing a kiss to his forehead. Down the hall, Charles watched from the doorway. He leaned one shoulder against the frame, tie loose, coffee forgotten in his hand. For the first time in years, there were no board meetings waiting, no urgent calls pressing on his conscience. There was only this, the stillness of home. He entered the kitchen, just as Oliver jumped down from the stool and sprinted toward the hallway. "I'm going to hang it up in the library," Oliver called, disappearing down the corridor, picture in hand. Mariana set 2 plates down and looked at Charles. "You have syrup in your coffee again." He grinned, lifting the mug. "I've learned to love surprises." They ate together, the kind of quiet between them that spoke of deep familiarity. It wasn't like the early dinners filled with business talk and careful silences. Now, their silences breathed comfort, not distance. After breakfast, they strolled through the East Wing, now converted into the heart of the Ashcroft Foundation. Desks lined the walls, each piled with books, tablets, and art supplies. Children's drawings fluttered from pinboards, and the sound of soft music played from a speaker tucked between shelves. "Tomorrow's the opening ceremony," Mariana said, her voice tinged with nerves. Charles looked at her. "You built this from the ground up." "We built this," she corrected gently. "It wouldn't exist without you." He stopped her beside the central wall, where a plaque read, "Ashcroft Foundation, in memory of who we lost, in hope of who we will find." Mariana's gaze lingered on the bronze etching of a small ribbon below the words, the same one that had belonged to her daughter. The ribbon Charles had kept all these years, without knowing why. She touched it, then reached. "Every child who walks through here will know they matter," she said. "That they're not alone," he added. They left the wing in quiet reverence. Outside, in the garden that now blossomed with color and life, Mariana sat on the stone bench that used to be her place of solitude. Now it was a place of peace. Oliver came running down the path. "I put the drawing in the frame room," he said, breathless. Come see, come see." He grabbed Mariana's hand with one and Charles's with the other, pulling them eagerly inside. They followed him to the sitting room that had once displayed only stoic portraits of Ashcroft men in somber frames. The room had changed. Oliver had claimed one corner and filled it with his own art, taped beside the old oil paintings without apology or pretense. Holding his last 2 robes, Mariana stepped closer. Beside the stiff portrait of Charles' great-grandfather was a new frame. Inside was Oliver's latest drawing, the 3 of them under a smiling sun, holding hands, the heart above their heads bright and bold. Below the drawing, on a small brass plate, were words etched in tiny cursive. "Chosen," she read aloud, her voice catching. "Not by blood, but by love." Mariana reached out to touch the glass of the frame, her fingers trembling slightly. Charles stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her lower back. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His silence wasn't distant now. It was reverent, filled with the weight of everything they'd been through. Oliver beamed, bouncing on his toes. "I wanted it to go there, so everyone knows." Mariana knelt in front of him. "Knows what, darling? We're a family, the real kind." Her throat tightened. She pulled him into a hug, wrapping him tight in her arms, her face buried in his hair. "You're the bravest little boy I've ever known." "You're the best mom," he whispered. Behind them, Charles's eyes burned, but he blinked away the sting. His empire had once been built on steel and stock prices. Now, it stood on laughter, on ribboned futurings, on the strength of a woman who had once been invisible in the very halls she now helped rule. The rest of the day passed in quiet moments. Mariana oversaw foundation logistics while Charles prepared for the upcoming gala, this time not for investors, but for the children they were helping. It was to be held in the same ballroom where Mariana had first calmed Oliver's storm. Only now, the chandeliers sparkled over long tables set with coloring books and cookies instead of caviar. That evening, as the last files were stacked away and the lights dimmed through the mansion, Charles found Mariana on the rooftop. The garden had changed too. Where once stood marble statues and strict symmetry, now bloomed wildflowers in every color. Wind chimes danced in the breeze, and small benches offered rest among the roses. She stood at the edge, watching the horizon. He joined her, placing a warm shawl over her shoulders. "You still come up here," he murmured. "It's where everything changed," she replied softly. "It's where I learned the difference between mourning and living." Charles turned toward her, his expression serious. "It was wrong, Mariana," he said. "Wrong for thinking you didn't belong. Wrong for seeing your pain as weakness. You are the strongest person I've ever known." She met his eyes. "And you are not the man you once were." He smiled faintly. "No, because you walked into this house and changed it. And me." They stood for a while longer, watching the lights flicker below them. Their city, their home, their legacy blooming like the garden around them. Later that night, in the living room, a blanket fort had been built. Mariana crawled inside with a stack of books. Oliver was nestled in a nest of pillows, eyes wide, waiting. Charles ducked in after her, holding a tray of snacks. As she began to read, her voice soft and steady, Oliver leaned into her side. Charles stretched out, his head resting near her knees, one hand gently wrapping around her ankle beneath the blankets. Fort filled with warmth, with comfort, with something sacred. And on the nearby wall, above the fireplaces, Oliver's framed drawings shimmered in the soft light. Chosen, not by blood, but by love. That's what they had become. Family, imperfect, unexpected, and entirely real. The heart of a home no longer built of stone, but of second chances. And of love, freely chosen,